So, where are the Galapagos Islands? Well, the Galapagos Islands used to be called the Enchanted Islands because they were hard to find. Even when you're sailing from one island to another that you can see, it is possible for the ship to go off course because of the strong currents. The ancient mariners thought that the islands possibly moved all by themselves, and there is some truth to that. The currents there are unpredictable and strong. The first official discovery of the Galapagos was by the Panamanian bishop Fray Tomas de Berlanga. He was not necessarily the first person to be there. The Incas have a myth that they were there earlier, but there's no evidence to support that. The bishop was on his way to Peru when his ship was becalmed, and it drifted off course. They were in desperate need of water and grass for horses that they were carrying at the time. They reached the Galapagos, but they had a great deal of difficulty finding fresh water, and there was plenty of salt water. 2 of the crew members died before they found fresh water, and 10 of the horses were lost. The bishop wrote a letter to King Charles I of Spain, and in the letter he noted the very tame tortoises and birds. But other than that, the land was considered to be entirely a waste. The Galapagos Islands themselves are about 600 miles to the west of Ecuador, and they consist of about 100 rocks and islands. There are 13 main islands, and the oldest of them is about 5 million years old. They're created by a hotspot to the west, and that hotspot is very similar to the hotspot that's at the Yellowstone, or for that matter, Hawaii. As with Hawaii, the hotspot, a thin spot in the Earth's mantle that allows lava to come up from the Earth's core, creates those islands. The youngest of the islands is Fernandina. Fernandina is the youngest of the islands, only about 45,000 years old, and there have been about 30 eruptions in the last 2 centuries. As the Earth's crust moves, it carries the islands southeast from the hotspot an inch or 2 a year. The big island is Isabella, about 700,000 years old. It erupts still occasionally, but there's enough earth available that's been created out of the lava for grazing tortoises. As we move steadily to the east, we arrive at Santa Cruz. There, the volcanoes are entirely dormant, and the island has its own forests, making it a fairly lush location for lots of different animals. The further to the east we go, the less volcanic the terrain, and the more earth has been created over the period of time as the islands are worn down slowly. The result of that is that as you go east, the islands tend to become much more lush, much more capable of supporting life. Effectively, the islands are on a giant conveyor belt, drifting to the east away from the hot spot. By the time you reach 3-million-year-old Hispaniola, the island is flat. And as it drifts to the east, the islands are worn down more and more. Further still to the east, the islands are submerged, and this process has been going on for about 30 million years. 90% of the plants and animals on the Galapagos are unique to those islands, and 95% of the plants and animals that were there when humans first arrived are still there. We are flying into Baltra, a small island just north of Santa Cruz. It used to be an Army Air Corps base. It was there in order to defend the Panama Canal Zone before World War II. The Army Air Corps abandoned it, and it is now a commercial airport. The Galapagos Islands each have 2 sets of names. One set of name is in English, and the other one is in Spanish. This is because in the early days, the Galapagos Islands were controlled by the English, and of course they became Spanish and then Ecuadorian. The most famous visitor to the Galapagos, of course, was Charles Darwin. He arrived there on the 15th of September, 1835, and at the time he was only 26 years old, and really he was just out of undergraduate school. He had just gotten his degree. He arrived on a ship, a British naval ship called the Beagle. It was doing surveying, and it had been in South American waters for the past 3 years. The Beagle's captain on this voyage was Robert Fitzroy, himself something of a naturalist. Fitzroy had been made the captain of the HMS Beagle on its first voyage.
Fitzroy was an officer on the HMS Beagle when the captain, presumably lonely and depressed on a very long voyage, shot himself in the head. While this was good for Fitzroy, he was made the captain, it troubled him because his family had a history of some mental instability and of similar ends. His uncle, the Viscount Castlereagh, had slit his own throat not long before. So before undertaking his first real long voyage as captain, he decided to invite a passenger, a gentleman's companion. Of course, he just couldn't fraternise with anybody. The person he chose, his second choice, by the way, was Darwin, an amateur botanist, and reassuringly, a man of the cloth, a man trained in religion.
Fitzroy was descended from royalty. The Fitz implies that he was illegitimate and the Roy of a king, and in fact he was descended from Charles II. As a result, he was politically well connected. The Beagle was a Cherokee-class 10-gun brig sloop of the Royal Navy, but her guns were reduced from 10 cannons to 6 when she was becoming a survey vessel, and there was a mizzen mast that was added to improve her maneuverability, thereby changing her from a brig to a bark. Captain Fitzroy was a wealthy man, and at his own expense, before the second voyage, he had the Beagle completely refitted. He had the upper deck raised as much as a foot, and Cherokee-class ships had the reputation of being coffin brigs. That is, they handled badly and were prone to sinking. By raising the deck, he gave the Beagle better handling and made her less liable to be top-heavy and capsize. And it also helped the decks to drain more quickly so that less water would be collected in the gunnels. Fitzroy took on board 22 brand new chronometers, and he employed the son of a watchmaker just to maintain them. He brought on board a new lightning conductor and 5 new barometers of a just patented type. The second voyage of the Beagle was the one commanded by Captain Fitzroy for the entire period of time, and this is the one where he brought Darwin along with him. They spent a total of about 3 years surveying the area around South America. That was the area that was of primary interest to the Royal Navy, especially the area around Tierra del Fuego. After leaving South America, they went to the Galapagos for 5 weeks, then on to Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Tasmania, and on around the world until they got back to England. Now, to find his traveling companion, Fitzroy sent to a friend in Cambridge, and that friend recommended Charles Darwin. The problem, of course, was that Charles Darwin had no educational background as a naturalist. He was not a zoologist or a botanist. He was trained as clergy. He was to be a vicar. But Darwin honed his skills in South America for 3 years before coming to the Galapagos. In comparison, he was only in the Galapagos for about 5 weeks. But it's the Galapagos period for which he is most famous. The entire trip took 5 years. Now, can you think of any other voyage that was to last 5 years?
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Gene Roddenberry patterned the Star Trek episodes on an earlier science fiction work called The Voyage of the Space Beagle, which itself was based on the voyage of the Beagle. Therefore, one would assume that that makes Spock playing the part of Darwin.
Fascinating.
This also explains why a beagle is the captain's pet in Star Trek Enterprise.
Where is the vault? Do you understand me?
I can't lock onto its language.
Our voyage starts at Baltra, where the old Army Air Force base was located. There we're going to jump on a ship called the Marianne. She's a barkentine, a little bit different from the Beagle's configuration.
John, I've given you the technical readout for the Marianne, and I've got the technical readout for the HMS Beagle. And what I want to do is I want to compare and contrast the two ships. First of all, the HMS Beagle was launched in 1820. When was the Marianne launched?
It was launched in 1997, Craig.
Well, the next thing I'm looking at is the rig. The Beagle started out as a brig sloop, and what that means is it had two masts. It had square sails on the forward mast, and then on the main mast it had square sails down to a point, and then it had a spanker in the back. Now, for its second voyage, the one that Charles Darwin is on, the captain of the ship had the Beagle refitted, and it was changed from a brig sloop into a bark. And what that means is it had three masts this time. The forward mast, again, has square sails on it. The main mast this time has square sails all the way down, and then the mizzen mast has that fore and aft sail in the back. How is the Marianne rigged?
Well, interestingly enough, it's known as a barkentine, and it also has three masts, the first of which has square sails, the forward one, and the following mast have fore and aft sails. So somewhat similar, but not quite the same, obviously.
Okay, well, let's take a look at the size of the ship. I've got the Beagle down here as having a length of 90 feet. How big is the Marianne?
It's 119 feet, so it's actually a little longer.
Well, it's pretty close, though. There's not that much difference
No.
between the two of them. And the beam I've got is 24 and a half feet for the Beagle.
Well, the beam on this ship is almost 26. It's 25.9.
So it's almost identical on the beam. Okay. And the draft I've got on the Beagle is 12 and a half feet.
Well, it could sail in much shallower waters then, because the draft on the Marianne is 16.7 feet.
Okay, that's interesting. Now, the ship's complement, the number of people that were on the ship, and this is for the second voyage of the Beagle, when it had been turned into a survey ship. Now, if it had been a man of war, it could have had as many as 120 people on it. But as a survey ship, its crew was only 65, plus it had 9 extra people for, as they refer to as supernumeraries. What's the crew capacity of the Marianne?
Much smaller, Craig. There's actually only 8 crew on this ship. But of course, they're not working the sails as often as the crew on your ship would have been.
Well, of course, that's true, because after all, the Marianne is motorized.
Yes, it is.
Okay. One other thing, when the Beagle was a ship of war, it had a complement of 10 cannons. But when it became a survey ship, it was reduced to 6 cannons. So how many cannons does the Marianne have?
Not a one, Craig. Not a single one.
Well, that's terrible. But even at that, the Beagle's bark was worse than its bite.
I knew that was coming, and you still got me.